Hello, and welcome to another episode of Daily Wisdom Words Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Renee O'Day. Daily Wisdom Words is an online community for writers all over the world. Please join us every Saturday at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, where we will be talking to some of the very distinguished guests, each one specializing in topics you don't want to miss.
Hi, everyone. I am Neil Chiretti, and I will be your co-host for today. We want to thank you for joining us, and a very warm welcome to another episode of Daily Wisdom Words Podcast. We're both excited to join you every Saturday at 9 a.m. Pacific. We also want to give a shout out to all the Daily Wisdom Words members who are listening. Want a sneak peek at our future guests? Go to our website, dailywisdomwords.com, where you'll have full access to our podcast page, which is updated every Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific. The link of the podcast page will be posted below in the description of this video. On that page, not only will you see the upcoming guests, but you'll also be able to submit any questions you have for that guest. When submitting a question, please be sure to include your email address. And you can also submit any feedback, any suggestions you have for this podcast. We want to hear from you.
Today's guest is recognized as an expert in many areas. We are honored to have Dr. Richard Heyer, a renowned psychologist and a professor of Emerson Pediatric Neurology. Darn it, I knew I was going to get that wrong. At the University of California, Irvine. Go Anteaters. Author of the book, The Neuroscience of the Brain, and the Audible lecture series, The Intelligent Brain. It's a series of fascinating lectures. Also, he has written numerous medical articles and widely recognized for his highly distinguished in psychometric and human intelligence. Welcome, Dr. Heyer.
Welcome.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to do it. Happy to do it.
So I thought we would start out with one of the more interesting aspects when we looked at you and your studies and everything is the G factor. And that's something that really fascinated all of us when we were doing our research. So could you go into that? Could you explain a little bit about that and a few of the details?
Sure. When most people think of intelligence, they often think of IQ. But IQ and the word intelligence really are not synonymous. Intelligence is a very broad category of mental abilities. IQ refers to a test score that estimates those mental abilities. And one of the interesting findings in psychology that's been replicated for 100 years is that if you take different mental abilities and have tests of different mental abilities, and what you'll see is scores on those tests are all positively related to each other. Called the positive manifold. And the fact that a test of spelling or a test or an arithmetic test or a test of visual spatial ability and a vocabulary test, all these different tests, the scores are related to each other. So that implies there's some underlying common factor to these different mental abilities. And that common factor is called the general factor. The shorthand is G. The G factor. So G stands for general, and it is what is common to all mental abilities. Now, not every mental ability has the same strength of relationship to the G factor. So some mental abilities are more G-loaded than other mental abilities, but all mental abilities have some G. And it turns out the standard kind of IQ tests that psychologists give are good estimates of the G factor because a standard IQ test has different subtests. It samples different mental abilities combines the scores into the IQ score. And that's why the IQ score, because it samples these different mental abilities, is a good estimate of G.
That's a very good point, because you bring up sort of running together, but not always as far as mental abilities. And you brought that up about how it runs together in the G. So then we also have cases like the savant, right, where they appear to not know or not be able to function in anything else but just one specific ability or talent. So how exactly does that work?
I wish I knew. I mean, nobody really knows. It's one of the
Right.
most amazing things to have an individual who has an astounding single focused specific mental ability and virtually no other mental abilities. So
Right.
often savants cannot take care of themselves. They appear to be developmentally retarded. But if
Right.
you ask them who could to name the 8 wives of Henry VIII, they can name the 8 wives, the dates of birth, and all
Right.
kinds of detail that they remember from reading encyclopedias. That would be one kind of savant. There are artistic savants who really don't communicate verbally and can't care for themselves, but can produce detailed, beautiful sculptures of animals. There are
Right.
musical savants. Sometimes they're blind, yet they can
Yeah.
play any piece of music after hearing it only once, and they can
Very
play
true.
it in any musical style
Right.
immediately.
Yeah.
So, and often these people have only this mental ability and have little, if any, of the G factor. And
Right.
it's an astounding thing about the brain. And when you see people that have this kind of savant ability, the question always is, well, how do they do it? And to
Right.
me, the more interesting question is, why can't I do it?
Interesting. Yeah.
And
Will
so
we ever
it's a
get to
mystery.
that point of figuring out how or why that's possible?
I hope so. That's really the point of all intelligence research, is to understand these things to the point where if this is a capability that many people have, how do we unlock it? We don't know
Right.
that that's true, but it's interesting.
Definitely.
And I have said, and my book, The Neuroscience of Intelligence, makes it clear that, in my view, the goal of all intelligence research is to understand intelligence, especially the G factor, to the point where we could increase it in individuals and
Sure.
increase it permanently and dramatically.
So, do you believe intelligence is inherited? And according to you, what is the best way to measure it?
Well, those are two questions.
Yes.
When you talk about measuring intelligence, the best measures are of the G factor, and they are not measures like a yardstick or a scale. They're technically they're technically interval scales. They don't have a real zero. So I don't want to get too technical on this, but you basically now, the best measures of individual differences or even average group differences are standardized IQ tests. As far as the genetic aspect of it, you asked me if I believe it. It's really never a question of what I believe or what I don't believe. I can tell you what the data say. And the data seem to be very clear that genes have an important influence on individual differences in intelligence. So the variability among people, among individuals, not groups, the variability among individuals is influenced by genetics. Now, having said that, for many years, people tried to disentangle what proportion of that variance, what proportion of those differences are related to genes and what might be related to environment. It turns out the story is far more complicated than that, because genes are influenced by the environment, and it turns out the environments that you seek out are influenced by your genes. And so now people don't really try to ascribe proportions all that much. The older behavioral genetic research showed that by the time a person was an adult, as much as 80% of the variance was influenced by genetics. This is what this means is apparent to parents who try everything they can think of to increase the intelligence of their kids. But by the time they're older, it's pretty well set. What the exact environmental influences are really not clear, because there are general influences like growing up in poverty or growing up in a stressful environment that likely have some impact on how genes express themselves. But no one has ever really been able to show specifically how that would work. However it works that the environment influences genes has to be some biological mechanism. So, and however it works, there are likely hundreds, if not 1,000 genes involved. They all interact with each other. So it's going to be a complicated story. And when a gene turns on or turns off over here, and over here you have a complex trait like intelligence, there might be 100 or more neurochemical steps in between. Now, my hope is, so this is complicated, but my hope is as people figure out what those steps are, they will find places in that sequence of events, what I call a cascade of events, where you could tweak it a little bit to maybe manipulate the outcome. Now, this is on the edge of science fiction. Well, right now, it's deep science fiction. I'm hoping that over time it moves more into the realm of possibility.
Right.
Well, we opened the atom and look what we found.
Well, it's interesting because I've always said that if you could figure out, as physicists apparently have, what the first 10 nanoseconds of the Big Bang was like, you should be able to figure out something about how the brain works underlying what we call intelligence, which is basically what we mean by intelligence simply is just reasoning ability, figuring things out.
I have a brother-in-law that's an astrophysicist, so I'll ask him about the 10 seconds of the Big Bang and get back to you.
Actually, it's the first nano. It's the first 10 nanoseconds.
Yes, nanoseconds. Yes. You have said that the IQ can predict health and mortality in people. Can you please explain to our audience why and how that is?
Yes. So there was a very large study that took place in Scotland. It began in the 1930s, where the Scottish government decided they were going to see the impact of the social environment on intelligence. And they gave a standardized IQ test to every single school child, basically on the same day throughout the entire country. So they then followed these kids. Remember, this was done in the 1930s. Many of those kids are still alive today. Periodically, they've been restudied. And in the last 10 years, they've been restudied with things like brain imaging. But earlier on, when they were in their 60s and 70s, researchers looked at their history of health, including when they died. And it turned out that if you divide all these kids into 4 groups based on their IQ scores at age 11 or 12 or 13, into quartiles. So you have the highest 25%, the next 25%, the next 25%, and the lowest 25%. The difference in mortality over time was, as I recall, I know I have a graph of this in the book, I think there were 40% or over 40% more deaths in the lower IQ quartile. Now, why this is true is not completely clear, but there are other health outcomes as well that distinguish the highest and the lowest group, defined only by this one test score, which was a score of abstract reasoning ability. So it is an empirical finding. People are trying to figure out what it is. Accident rates are higher in lower IQ people, whether it's driving or falling off ladders. Everyone in Scotland had access to health care because it was a national healthcare system. So access to healthcare wasn't an obvious explanation for this. So it's a fascinating finding, and it's another reason why it's important to understand these relationships, because people's health and possibly even their mortality is related.
Right.
Well, there was a similar test done in England. I believe Binet and Simons wrote it. And the Minister of Education had the children tested to see which ones were in the lower category and needed more help. You talk about that in your lecture series, which I am listening to. It is fascinating. I'm on number 6. I can't wait to finish. So can you explain that?
Yes, the origin of the IQ test goes back to a guy named Alfred Binet, who was in France. And at the time, around the turn of the 20th century, the Minister of Education in France had a problem. And the problem was teachers in France were sending a lot of kids into special schools for remedial education because they weren't doing very well. So that wasn't the problem. It was nice that France had these remedial education programs. The problem was teachers were sending kids who had behavioral problems to these remedial education programs. So they were cognitively able, but teachers just wanted them out of the classroom. So the Minister of Education wanted to fix this problem, and he asked Binet to develop a test to be able to categorize which kids really were on the lower end of mental ability and needed extra help. So it was a completely good context in which the Binet developed this test. And the test is now many iterations beyond what Binet developed. And it is now much more sophisticated statistically in terms of its reliability and its validity. And it calculates the score in a completely different way that is now much more sophisticated. But the origins were really back in France to solve that problem.
What is the test called? And do we use it today?
Yeah, now it is turned into the Stanford Binet, because people at Stanford University took Binet's test and redid it for the United States. They renormed it, they changed it around, and made it a little more sophisticated. And there are now many iterations of it. So there's the Stanford Binet test. There's also the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale is also widely used, and that was developed independently. So these are good tests. They are administered individually by a trained person to one person at a time. And the total IQ scores are good estimates of the G factor. There are also other tests, like the Raven's Progressive Matrices test, which I also show in the book an example of. And that is a test of abstract reasoning. And that test turns out to be a highly loaded G test. So researchers often use the Raven's test to get an estimate of G, because you can administer to a group of people all at once and it only takes about 45 minutes compared to a much longer one-on-one WACE or Stanford Binet test.
And we talk about, as you mentioned, the education and these kind of tests being run on students or at universities. And one of the things we've seen is teaching methods in basic classrooms, especially K through 12, has been roughly the same over the years with a few minor changes as technology comes in. As we get more into technology and we become more technologically advanced and discover these tests, and we just know more because the world is becoming smaller through technology, do you think that's going to improve the overall learning process, as far as teaching students and what they can gain, and as opposed to the standard teaching method of, this is what it is, this is what the textbook says, here it is? Well, is it the method or the teacher that matters?
This is an interesting question. And I will tell you my view on this, which is informed by research. And I will tell you my view in stark terms, just to start the discussion.
Right.
In stark terms, a tremendous amount of data over decades is consistent in showing that educational achievement is mostly due to variables the student brings to school, not variables the school brings to the student.
Wow.
Okay? Yeah. And the most important variable the student brings to school is individual intelligence. Smarter students do better, no matter what the method.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And the amount of variance among students in terms of their educational achievement, the amount of that variance that is contributed by all school variables combined, that includes teacher variables, how well the school is funded, the professionalism of the, all of that stuff, less than 10% of the variance.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And teachers are furious when they hear this. And, I understand that.
Obviously, right.
But for any individual student, teachers can make an enormous difference in that student's life and in motivating that student. Okay, especially if the student is not motivated by the home environment. But the one single variable above all else that accounts for about 50% of educational achievement is the student's intelligence. So that is the truth of it, as I see it. Okay, when I say the truth of it, that's how I read the research.
Well, you're an expert.
Well, yeah, but I'm not an expert in education. And the ironic part of what I just said is that within the field of education, there is virtually, in the United States, no discussion about the role intelligence plays in education. It is absent. As a matter of fact, there is hostility to the term, a denial of all that research. And in California, there's recently been published some proposed changes in the high school curriculum, or the whole K through 12 curriculum. And an educational a professor of education who is in charge of the committee doing this stated very clearly up front that they don't believe in the concept of talent. They don't believe it.
Wow.
So you can see the headwinds within the field of education trying to apply what is very clear in the intelligence literature over decades in giant studies replicated that the most important variable is the student's intelligence. Now, the student's intelligence by the time they get to high school, that's fixed. Now you have a legitimate question about what kinds of teaching methods might maximize an individual student's educational attainment. And there is research on things like mindset growth and being a visual learner versus an auditory learner. It's my understanding, I'm not an expert in this area, that none of that research, none of it is replicated to the point where you would say you want to base educational policy on it. So many schools have tried many policies, typically not based on good research. And in the book, I talk about if you're a school system and you want, to know what the research is, you have to look at independently replicated results, not the research the salespeople are showing you to sell a particular system that's going to raise IQ, or there is no system to raise IQ as far as I know, and I think I would know if there was.
I think so.
I would be using it.
Darn it, I was going to ask you to help me. Why do people with more gray matter have higher IQs?
If you're taking that from one of my papers, it's a slight misunderstanding that everybody seems to have about that paper. It's not that there's more gray matter, there were more gray matter areas. It's that were related to IQ tests. But the idea is there are now much more sophisticated neuroimaging studies than what I published in the book, because the book is a few years old and this field is advancing extremely rapidly. The short answer is the more gray matter in certain parts of the brain, the more neurons in those parts of the brain. So the more processing power your brain has in those critical areas. That's the short answer. One of the things I say in the book is I have 3 laws. And the first law is no story about the brain is simple. And so that simple story I just gave you is a nice discussion point, but in fact, it's extremely complicated. And we really don't understand the relationship between the number of neurons in a brain area and performance on a high G test. But what we now have that was just beginning when I wrote the book, I only alluded to one brand new study in the book, is imaging of the connectivity of the brain, how brain areas are connected to each other. And those connectivity patterns in an individual seem to be very stable, like a fingerprint. The claim is you can identify who a person is looking at their brain connectivity from a brain image. And moreover, the connectivity pattern is related to IQ scores.
Wow.
So this is where
that is fascinating.
Now, let me say that once you find the neurocircuitry, the brain area connections, that is fascinating, but it's just the beginning, because then you have to figure out how that neurocircuitry works. What are the neurotransmitters involved? And then way down the line, you want to be able, in my view, to be able to tweak those systems to increase intelligence. That's the science fiction part. But as more and more of this brain and neuroscience research looks at intelligence, I'm hoping to move the boundary between what's known and what's science fiction closer together.
Right.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
That is truly fascinating.
Are we at that stage now? You said, first of all, at what age, what is the earliest age do you think that these tests should be conducted in a person, whether it's a baby, a toddler, or a certain age, to determine what their future or what their intelligence level will be?
That's controversial. There are some scales that have been designed for really newborns and young children. They're called the Bailey scales, and they're developmental milestones, and they seem to correlate somewhat with later IQ scores. IQ scores look probably stable in early teens. And it's different for every individual. And there are brain imaging studies showing the development of the brain cortex and relating aspects of the thickness of the cortex to later IQ. These are interesting studies. And there's a suggestion that in the first 4 or 5 years of life, the cortex gets thicker, but then after age 5, it starts to thin. And the rate of that change is related to intelligence, with the suggestion that more intelligence goes with greater thinning, which could be related to some kind of efficiency of function.
Yeah.
Right.
So the concept of brain efficiency being related to intelligence in some ways came from our 1988 study where we found inverse correlations between brain imaging of glucose use in the brain was correlated negatively with how well people did on that Ravens test during the imaging. So we were able to see how the brain was functioning while people were solving abstract reasoning problems. And the counterintuitive result was the harder their brain worked, the less well they did on the test. And this gave us what is called the brain efficiency hypothesis of intelligence. And since 1988, there have been an awful lot of studies about brain efficiency. Some support the concept, others don't. So it's still kind of a work in progress to figure out how the brain might be efficient and how that might relate to something like differences among people in reasoning.
So I was just to finish that thought. So basically, if we test, say, a 5 or 6 year old, it might not be the most accurate findings of how they'll be when they'll grow up or in their 20s or in their 30s, as far as intelligence is concerned.
Yeah, I think 5 or 6. I don't even know why you would want an IQ test at that age.
Good point.
It really. It's not gonna be that predictive of the future, and even later on, IQ tests only predict success about 50% of success. So there are a lot of factors involved in success, and no IQ researcher ever said that IQ or intelligence is the only important variable. It just turns out empirically to be usually the single most important variable in general. But if you want some metric of success in a particular occupation, and that occupation is not a high G occupation, then it doesn't matter. If it's a high G occupation, or the higher the G necessary to be successful in an occupation, the more an IQ test will give you some indication of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, like you, I'm in California, and I had 3 children go through kindergarten to 12th grade, and every year they were tested. It was called the STAR test. It's STAR testing, and the first test was given in 1st grade. And it's called the Naglieri test. Have you heard of it?
No.
The Naglieri, but it's spatial reasoning. Okay. And then they go, and from 2nd grade, then it's, writing and, comprehension, math, and all that. Do you think that's more memorization, as far as like when you give a child a test every spring on what they learned? Don't you think it's more memorization than intellect?
Well, there are a couple of things mixed together there. And so I don't know those particular tests. So normally, if they give the tests periodically, there'll be different forms of the test. So you don't remember the exact items. So you don't go home and look up the exact items. But the broader question is, if the tests are well designed, they are not measuring just memory. Something like visual spatial ability and reasoning ability, general reasoning ability, and most of the more complex mental abilities always have some component of memory in them. But that's not the same as memorization of items. So something like a test of general information, you might think is a memory test of how much you remember when you learn these things in previous grades. But usually, people who score higher on reasoning ability generally score higher on these tests, usually because they have better memories. So memory is an important component of mental abilities. I think that's the best shorthand way of saying it.
Right.
Well, do you believe in common sense as far as anything dealing with intellect, or, you know, more people have common sense? And
I have never seen a test of common sense. So if you're going to talk about,
kids.
I mean, when I'm talking about results from intelligence tests,
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about
Mm-hmm.
sophisticated tests, sophisticated statistical analyses, some experiments, various research designs. I don't know any research on common sense.
Okay. I was just curious. I was just really curious.
Yeah. Well, you know, some people talk about practical intelligence. They've tried to measure
Mm-hmm.
practical intelligence. Turns out when people come up with tests of wisdom or practical intelligence or these other concepts, the tests usually are highly correlated to G-tests. So it's the burden is on these other test developers to show that they're measuring something separate from the G factor. And usually that doesn't work out so well.
So is there, because you mentioned several of these things where it's not necessarily inaccurate, but you talked about the IQ and how it's not definitive in every single area. Is there a level of intelligence that is expected from people in general? Like, is there like, okay, this is a level that everybody should have in this area, or else, or is there no definitive number, or does it depend on the individual?
All those things are true. All those things are true. So there are general guidelines, and these are statistical guidelines, and it mostly has to do with percentages. So if you are in the top 2% of a really good standardized IQ measure, you're in the top 2%. That means you and somebody else are probably the two smartest people out of 100 random people.
Right.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
People in that percentage usually can be successful in most activities, but you will immediately see the flaw in what I just said. You may be in a job where your interpersonal relationships and your interpersonal ability is more important than your ability to solve some reasoning problems. In that case, you may fail if you don't have those other skills. But in general, there are ranges, I think it's in the book actually, there are ranges for various professions. Some require, you know, an IQ, you know, if you're going to be like a chemist or a lawyer or a pharmacist, something that requires reasoning ability, usually the minimum to be successful in the schooling that's required to do that is around 120 IQ. You know, and there can be exceptions to this. So there are guidelines. In general, the higher, the better your reasoning ability, the better you're going to do, but it's not a sure bet at all. I can tell you, I know a lot of smart people that you wouldn't want to spend 10 minutes with. I know a lot of smart people that you wouldn't trust with you know, for anything. So
Right.
whether somebody is a good person or a likable person or a person with common sense, that's all independent of whatever IQ they may or may not have.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do
It's
you
not an
believe?
indication of morality, is what you're as far as, yeah.
Not at all. And there's no implication that a high IQ person or a high intelligent person has any more moral worth than anybody else. There's absolutely no superior, inferior, inherent judgment from an IQ score. And intelligence researchers are very sensitive to this, because when people try to make public policy based on intelligence information, there often is an implication of, well, these people are inferior and these people are superior. And that just does not logically follow from IQ tests. That's a value judgment.
Sure.
This is fascinating in your book, is the twin factor. Twins that are raised together and twins that are separated at birth. Could you explain that to our audience?
Well, the idea of studying twins, it's a natural experiment to separate out genes and environment. So if you have identical twins, you can see how similar they are when they're adults. And they can be similar on physical characteristics, but they also can be similar on intelligence test scores, personality test scores. And you say, geez, identical twins are more similar to each other than fraternal twins. Identical twins have 100% of their genes in common, more or less. And fraternal twins have about half that, more or less. So when you see identical twins are more similar, it's a natural assumption that genes are involved. The flaw in that train of thought is that identical twins are also typically raised in the same environment. So when you have identical twins who have been separated at birth and adopted into different families with different environments, that's a natural experiment that separates out genetic influences from environmental influences. And so at the University of Minnesota a couple of decades ago, they started looking for identical twins who were separated at birth and raised by different adoptive families. And in the course of a number of years, they located 100 of these twins in the United States and Europe, in England. And they interviewed these people. A lot of them came to the University of Minnesota, took a battery of tests. They typically stayed about 5 days. And basically, the fundamental finding was identical twins reared apart in different families with different environments, typically not knowing they had a twin, like zero contact. It turned out those twins were extremely similar to each other, almost as similar as identical twins reared together.
Wow.
And that seemed to indicate that the genetic influences were more powerful than environmental influences.
Oh.
Fascinating. Very fascinating.
Yeah. There's so much that we could discuss because and we're so eager to ask, but I guess at this point I would bring this discussion to an end for now. Can you briefly explain about your Intelligent Brain lecture series and what you talk about in there and how many parts are there to it and where people can find it?
Well, the lecture series, it's a video series. It was produced as part of the Great Courses. So a number of your viewers might be familiar with the Great Courses. You can Google it. It's the company is called the Teaching Company, or I think they just changed to the Great Courses Company. And they have subjects, all kinds of subjects. And I did this lecture series. There are I think 18 lectures. Each one is 30 minutes. But it was done in 2013. So it's a little dated. But if you want to hear me talk about these things, you can go to the great courses. I think usually it's on sale for about $25. I wouldn't pay more. And the book that you are graciously holding up is the lecture series. The great courses is called The Intelligent Brain. The book is newer. The book is called The Neuroscience of Intelligence. And the book covers the key topics in more depth. It was really written for psychology students and neuroscience students. But I'm happy to say the reviews of that book typically point out how clearly it's written for non-technical people. So if you don't have any technical background, I think the book is more up to date than the lecture series. And the book is easily found on Amazon. I think the Kindle version is about $17. The book and the lecture series has a lot of figures, a lot of color images, especially the brain images. So I can see it as an Audible book, but I think it might be better to get the visuals.
I will.
Yeah,
and I
absolutely.
thank you for joining us.
Well, you're welcome.
This has been an honor to have you.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed doing it. I'm always happy to talk about this kind of stuff.
Well, you are amazing at it. So
join us next week as we talk to our latest Daily Wisdom Words Poetry Contest winner, Sarah Temple. Don't forget to submit a question for Sarah by Wednesday of this week. To do that, visit our podcast page at the link below in the description of this video. And remember, if we pick your question to be on the show, you get a surprise gift from us. Thank you all for joining us and hope you join us next week.